Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Lean In Olympia. This is a bi-monthly or twice a month broadcast from Interfaith Works. Interfaith Works is a nonprofit organization based in Olympia. We are a social service provider to vulnerable adults through a shelter that we manage. We are also an interfaith network of 30 plus faith communities. Our mission is peace and justice through interfaith cooperation and understanding. It's great to be here with you today. Lean In Olympia is a show that talks about conversations at the crossroads of humanity, justice, and belief. And if you want to check out past episodes or stay up to date on what we're doing as an organization, please check out our website at interfaith-works.org or check out the Interfaith Works Facebook page or YouTube channel. So thank you very much. My name is Corey Passons. I'm a program manager for Interfaith Relations. That means I have the privilege of working with the 30 plus faith communities in our network. I also have the privilege of being in this space of Lean In Olympia once a month, where I talk with guests through the perspective of interfaith relations. We also do a broadcast each month with homeless services as a focus, which is our main social lens and offering to the community. But I stand in a space with Lean In Olympia where we look at issues that relate to how we function as society, as individuals, as people who make meaning, as people who experience life in community. And so today I'm pleased to welcome two guests, both of whom are professors at St. Martin's University in Lacey, and I want to hear more about that university from them in a moment. But I want to introduce Doctors Robert Hauhart and William Stadler. Robert Hauhart is a professor and former chair of the Department of Society and Social Justice at St. Martin's University. He's serving as faculty there since 2006. Dr. Hauhart leads the undergraduate criminal justice and legal studies programs within the liberal arts curriculum and acts as a pre-law advisor and offers courses within the sociology department. Dr. Hauhart spent 20 years working in the criminal justice system in Pennsylvania, New York, and the District of Columbia, and his career has been balanced between practicing law and serving as an educator. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. And Dr. William Stadler is an assistant professor and program director for the Criminology and Criminal Justice program in the Department of Society and Social Justice at St. Martin's University in Lacey, Washington. Prior to this current role, he worked for nearly a decade in both academic and applied settings related to the justice system, primarily with healthcare, corrections, and social service agencies responsible for delivering interventions and treatments to at-risk and justice-involved populations. Well, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So greetings to both of you. I wondered as we begin, if you could tell us a little bit about the university in which you both work. Sometimes it's helpful to have a sense of context into what systems and what communities in which people are doing their work and doing their ongoing formation in their careers and the place in which they make meaning. So would you both be willing to spend a minute or two and tell us about the university that you're working with?
I'll be happy to start off and then we'll follow up with observations. St. Martin's University was started in 1895, I believe. At that time, it was intended to be a boys' high school. The first year, and maybe even the second, third years, there was one student. That's all. And so it was a very small effort, originating at a Benedictine community in Minnesota. And this was kind of a new outreach experience. And very, very gradually, the high school grew. And it was a boarding school, so it was attracting students from Tacoma. At that time, of course, 25 miles was quite a considerable distance to travel. So in fact, you would board from Tacoma. And students from Minnesota, from the original Catholic Benedictine community would come, faculty would come. In the early years, faculty were all church related and gradually began to hire lay people to teach. It was continued as a boys' high school until sometime in the 1960s, I think, maybe the late 60s. And then very, very briefly, I think it was a coeducational high school for a couple years. Mm-hmm. And then there was a 2-year college prep program started. It then became a 4-year college, coeducational, and achieved university status about 20 years ago. And that's sort of based on the number of majors. I think there's 29 or 30 perhaps majors that are offered now, as well as minor concentrations. There are a few master's programs, and there is one new Ph.D. program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so it's a Catholic university. Will, is there anything else you'd like to add about St. Martin's?
Sure. Yeah, I can kind of talk about it from today's standpoint. So it's, as Robert had mentioned, it's rooted in the Catholic Benedictine identity. It's one of the only Benedictine institutions that's west of the Mississippi River. I think there are only a handful, really, and one of only a couple that are west of the Rockies, if I remember correctly. But by today's standards, the university is driven pretty distinctly by its Catholic faith and identity, and it's centered around a liberal arts education with focus on community, faith, reason, and service as being some of those core pillars of the institutional framework. So a lot of the students here at St. Martin's receive a liberal arts education. Some are in more professional schools like engineering or business, but by and large, the vast majority of students here receive a pretty comprehensive education in the liberal arts.
Okay, thanks. And before I get into an introduction of the topic today, would you also, each of you, feel comfortable sharing what your own personal spiritual or religious background is? Is it mandatory for professors to be Catholic at St. Martin's, or how do you identify or function as a person of a religious person, perhaps, or as a person who's making meaning?
I'll be happy to start again. It is not mandatory for faculty to be Catholic. I think that would be contrary to the Benedictine spiritual approach. I am not principally a religious or a spiritual person. Like many people in America today, which is a secular society, I conceive of myself as principally secular. At the same time, I certainly recognize the benefits that the Benedictine philosophy supplies to St. Martin's. It is a very safe community. That's one of the things that is a big appeal to all the students, all the faculty, and all the staff. And so I honor that tradition, even though I don't consider myself, a follower of that tradition. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the best characterization I can offer you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. What Robert was mentioning, particularly around honoring the Benedictine tradition, I would say that I would wager, I guess, that most faculty here are not Roman Catholic and don't derive from that specific faith. At the same time, I am Catholic. I'd say I call myself a quasi-practicing Catholic. And I think one of the things that did appeal to me about St. Martin's and coming here was the sense of community that is really cultivated around the Benedictine tradition, and the focus on inclusiveness and social justice as major areas of emphasis for this institution and the Abbey, which works very closely with the university community here.
Yeah. Well, thanks to each of you for that. I really do appreciate it. It's very helpful when we have topics like this to have a wider sense of what we're bringing to the table and the places from which we're coming and operating. Today, we are going to be talking about the topic of gun violence in America. It's a topic that evokes instant emotion and also reflection, oftentimes anguish. We have recently, as a country, been subject to tragedies in Atlanta and Boulder and others, even since these two recent tragedies. So one of the questions we'll be asking today is, why does America have such a perhaps singularly unique relationship with guns compared to other nations? Gun violence and gun ownership in the United States are seemingly wildly out of sync with other countries. We want to ask some questions about that. And then I'd like to ask some questions about what are some of the costs that each of my guests today, what are some of the costs that these rates of gun ownership and gun violence have in our country, to the general public, perhaps, to prison populations, to legislation, and how gun ownership and violence taxes our medical system, insurance rates, for example. So I want to open that topic up today to our guests. And before we do that, I'd like to just talk about a matter of perspective. Last week, the President Joe Biden reflected on the United States' exceptional gun violence problem. And the phrase that he used was this international embarrassment. As he revealed his first executive actions on the issues, was considered to be very strong language by many, but to some it seemed self-revelatory. Biden emphasized that mass shootings in this country are only part of the problem, and also talked about executive orders related to ghost guns or kits. So I wanted to begin by just asking each of our guests today how they would describe the current American experience with gun violence. We heard President Biden use the phrase an international embarrassment. How would you phrase or frame the current experience that we're having with gun violence in America? Will, would you like to, or Robert, were you jumping in? Either of you are free to begin.
Okay. I think the gun violence results from the experience many Americans have of being oppressed, quite frankly, by the economic system, by experiencing violence in their own homes. That violence did not necessarily happen with a gun. Mm-hmm. It happened with a whip. It happened with a hand. It happened with a punch. It happened with sexual molestation. There's residual anger and fear. People who've been victimized are the most likely group to become victimizers themselves. Mm-hmm. And so the guns, are just a means. The people who pick up a gun do so because it's available, number one, and they are really angry for the most part, and they're going to direct that anger at themselves or at others. Of the 40,000 gun deaths every year now in the United mm-hmm. States, mm-hmm. The great majority are suicide.
Yes.
23,000 to 24,000 are suicide. Maybe 14,000, a little more, are homicide. And then the 2,000 to 3,000 that are left over are accidental deaths. Mm-hmm. And suicide and homicide are almost two responses to the same thing, and they're much closer than people believe. It's just a question of whether that anger is directed at oneself or it's directed outward at someone else. And, so the real issue is that this is a tough country to live in. This is a tough culture to live in. We're very punishment oriented. Parents who do not know how to parent end up taking that too far. Parents who are in extreme situations have no support, take it out on the vulnerable. The vulnerable are children in their home. And so the guns, again, are just the manifestation of that. It's really much more complex than people believe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I would agree with Robert that one of the things that's probably a defining characteristic of the United States relative to other countries is access to guns. So part of what really drives America's, you'll hear the phrase America's gun epidemic or mass violence epidemic, can really be driven by access to guns, access to and prevalence of firearms in this country. But as Robert mentioned, gun violence is essentially a symptom. It's not necessarily the root cause of the problem. Guns aren't, but they are certainly a symptom of a larger societal problem, which is the fact that our country is culturally oriented around violence.
Looking to a deeper causality to guns, and I'm just curious about how you hold that in terms of are you making a statement or an argument that there's more emotional or economic pressures in our society that lead towards expressions of violence than in other places, or how are you holding and managing the discrepancies of gun violence expressions in our country with what you were talking about with the causes for such an event?
Well, initially, I would say our country has honored violence, for several hundred years. We opened the West by violently taking land away from indigenous communities. We've been the policeman for the world, or think we are, for a long time. We're always ready to intervene in foreign situations and do it with force. You can start with anyone you choose: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, many more. The model modeled by our leaders is you can use force to get what you want, and you'll never be held accountable. The people who prosecuted Vietnam, it's very clear that they lied for a decade about the numbers, about the support, about the effect of North Vietnam and its communist leader Ho Chi Minh. It was lies after lies after lies. So you can lie, you can kill, and you can get away with it. That's pretty much the message out there, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I would just add that the manifestation of gun violence is, it's predicated on this access to firearms. And the United States, I think, is the singular most country where access to weaponry, personal weaponry, far exceeds that of other countries. Right? And so, as of today, we essentially have almost one gun in our country for every person that exists, which is more than 330 million. Right? So, the access to weapons is pervasive in our country. It's easy to get, and we also have this culture of individualization and freedom. And I think a lot of our gun culture is driven by this fear. And frankly, our country was founded on this fear of infringing on individual right and our access to protect ourselves, protect our liberty. And that was one of the primary reasons for the creation of the Second Amendment. Although there's some argument around what the Second Amendment stands for and what the original framers of the Constitution meant by the Second Amendment, with a well-regulated militia versus the way that we currently conceptualize the modern level of firearms as being an individual right as a citizen. But nevertheless, it's all basically grounded in access to firearms, whereas other countries regulate them to much strict degree.
And I'd like to take a perspective through each of you to other countries where you might be seeing examples of legislation or at least culture that you see as inspiring towards mitigating gun violence. However, before that, Will, I wanted to note that you referenced the Second Amendment, and one of my inquiries today was at the formation of such an amendment. Was a weapon like an AR-15 or any of these military grade weapons that today we see images of almost daily in the news, or we hear about, the access to them. These kind of weapons were not even in the wildest imagination of people who were military trained at the time. I'm just curious how each of you, perhaps professionally, have contemplated this argument about the formation of maybe a traditionalist approach, or I'm not sure exactly how they frame it, but at the time when there was single barrel guns being produced compared to now, how each of you understand the relationship with the Second Amendment, with the current expression of these incredibly lethal weapons that are running rampant through our country right now.
Go ahead, Will.
Well, I think it's a complicated issue, to be honest, because there's a lot to be said of the originalist interpretation of the Constitution and what the founders really intended with the language that they used, and this can be evident in the Columbia v. Heller decision in, I think it was 2008, which essentially granted this individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense and protective purposes. If I remember correctly, Justice Scalia, himself being a self-described originalist, was the one who penned the decision in that particular case and outlined the framework for that decision, which was essentially that sort of an omission of the preface to the section which says, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. He more or less omitted discussion about the well-regulated militia, and the original intent, as many other scholars argue, was this fear of government intervention or government tyranny against the citizens, right? So citizen militias could protect against the federal government and or other governments.
Yeah, that decision is a travesty because it's apparent from any reading of the history of the Second Amendment that the emphasis was on permitting Americans and ensuring that Americans could be part of a well-regulated militia. That was necessary in the colonist view because of what King George and the British had done. And, that was going to be the protection for the community. Since the colonists had also inspired a great deal of hatred among indigenous Americans, they quite reasonably believed, too, they probably needed to be protecting themselves against indigenous Americans, because they'd made many of the tribes very angry by pushing them off the land. And so they created their own necessity to have a protection for the community in that regard. But it was all about, protecting the community. It was not based on any individual right whatsoever. And that misreading, has encouraged, Second Amendment, if I may say so, fanatics who see nothing but the Second Amendment. They don't bother to read the other parts of the Constitution, which would always be helpful, I think. And with respect to the guns that are available, yes. Of course, when the Constitution was drafted, we're talking about muskets, which you had to load with black powder and, some sort of projectile, and then you had to tamp it down. And, there was quite a bit of time there for you to reflect on what you were doing, whether or not you really needed this weapon. And, of course, they shot only one shot at a time. And then there you were again, right back to, musket reloading, which is a rather arduous process, even if you're fast and good at it. And of course, they didn't shoot as far. They did not have exploding cartridges. Now what you can buy is these hollow points, which when they impact with a person, they explode inside the body. It's shocking damage, shocking amount of damage
Mm-hmm.
for no purpose. You can kill somebody with a 22, with an old shell. You don't need any of this. It's one more example of our culture, which, bigger is better, and other ridiculous ideas. One of which is, you need something that apparently could stop a tank in your personal armament. For what? I've never needed it. I've never had to stop a tank or stop anyone else, really.
I hope you don't encounter that situation anytime soon, Robert. I was wondering if either of you would like to just hang out for a moment on the Second Amendment and the well-regulated militia clause that you're talking about as the second kind of part of the Second Amendment. We've seen just here in Olympia groups that use the term militia to describe themselves as protectors of private property and even of civic and civil liberties. And one of the means by which they assert themselves publicly is through the flagrant brandishing of firearms, some of which are in the form of long guns or assault rifles. And we saw a real escalation of this during the recent election cycle. I'm wondering if each of you could speak to the legality of standing for these groups to name themselves as militia, and if there might be any way to consider how, as a society, we could have more of a sense of safety from these self-labeled groups.
I'm going to pass most of this off to Robert because he's the legal scholar. However, I will say that there has often been this conflation of the First and Second Amendment. And a lot of the groups that you're referring to have invoked the First Amendment and infringement upon that right to suppress their voice. And I think that that's a significant issue that as a society we're still sort of grappling with. Issues of privacy, issues of freedom of speech, especially when they relate to both the First and Second Amendment. So I'd be curious to hear Robert's thoughts about this as a lawyer.
Well, I could talk about it as a lawyer, but I think that actually the sociological frame of reference is more helpful. Groups like to identify themselves in some positive way. And, by claiming the label of militia, these groups can contend, in fact, that they are protecting democracy and they are protecting the community and they are doing all these beneficial things. And then, in fact, all of a sudden, they're assaulting the Capitol and taking over the Capitol on January 6th and threatening our congresspeople, our senators. There were communications about actually killing various members of Congress. And so, the pushback has to be the fact that, people can identify themselves any way they wish, but the rest of us don't really need to honor exaggerated, inflated, self-serving labels. We just don't need to listen to it. You can say you're protecting the community when you take over a national wildlife refuge. You can say things like that. But the rest of us don't have to bend down and concur. And that angers some folks, and out come the guns, out come the weapons. And at that point, the government has been challenged and the government has to stand firm. On January 6th, the government was inept. They were incompetent. They were not ready. That's been pretty well established. They have to be ready. And, I certainly hope that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell are listening carefully to the hearings they're conducting and going to make sure that they are more ready. They have to be. There is no choice in the modern world to be, not in charge if you're the government. You are in charge by definition. And they weren't ready and they weren't in charge. They let the fulcrum, balance the other way. So again, these groups, they have to be watched carefully. Domestic terrorists need to be watched more carefully than foreign terrorists because they're the bigger threat. That's true, even though the single biggest event everybody will always point to, is September 11. Mm-hmm. But if you accumulate all the small domestic terrorist events, they're overwhelming in terms of their frequency and their cumulative violence. You can think of McVeigh and Oklahoma City as one example, but then there are many others, and like I say, they're much more frequent. They're much more the problem. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the FBI and other entities which are responsible for monitoring it have not done a great job. That's a problem for us.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the issues with the public expressions of the militia that we witnessed and many of us experienced firsthand as we were out in the streets was that the presence of guns is described by them as being something that they have a right to have, and they use it to protect freedoms, and yet the experience of people who are in the proximity of those guns is absolute fear and a loss of safety. So there's a deep, and I think an irreconcilable irony that's happening with this escalation of publicly touted firearms. And I also just want to note that when you talk about domestic terrorists, Robert, and mass shooters, that it's important to remember and to name that the predominance of people in this country who perpetuate mass shooters are essentially, they look like me, white males, Christian. So we have to come to terms with the fact that there's a sociological or maybe a spiritual problem, a sickness, if you will, with white males committing acts of violence, and also people who are living and breathing within certain strands of the Christian tradition. We need to be able to name that. Each of you look at society through various lenses, criminology, sociology. You've spent time working in the criminal justice system. You spent time in the classroom, working with people of all ages and types. How do you define some of the costs of gun violence? I mentioned that the loss of a loved one is a loss that's a permanent loss. That's a type of cost that we need to name. It's one of the primary costs of gun violence. But the two of you, as you look professionally and through your careers, how do you define some of the major costs of gun violence on this country?
Feel free to go ahead, Will.
Well, so I have a couple of different perspectives that I view this issue. First and foremost, as a criminologist, I think of the gun violence problem in America stemming largely from what we talked about previously, which is access to weapons, this culture of fear, something that's unique to the United States. And so sociologically, it's an interesting phenomenon that we have yet to unpack completely. But nevertheless, I see it as a scholarly pursuit, an area worthy of exploration and interest. And I've never really thought about it from a religious standpoint, as you sort of invoked earlier. You talked about some of the religious connections or variables that may be related to gun violence in America. So I come at it from that perspective, but I also think of gun violence as being a public health problem because it's one of the leading causes of death in the United States. As Robert had mentioned earlier, not only with suicide, but also with person-on-person gun violence in America. We lose, on average, about 100 people per day, if I remember correctly, the last statistics I saw, to gun violence. And to me, that represents a significant issue that should rise to the level of public health concern, much like cancer, much like diabetes and heart disease, and those things that we talk about regularly. And we try to think of preventive measures.
Yeah. Yeah, the public health lens, hugely important perspective. Robert, how do you define some of the costs of gun violence in this country?
I think initially I share your recognition that there's tremendous personal cost and family cost and community cost when someone dies. And while accidental deaths are a very small proportion, less than around 10%, we'll say, of the gun violence deaths, they really are as destructive in every respect as suicides and homicides. When I worked for the District of Columbia government, I ran a small law office, 6 attorneys, 2 investigators, 2 secretaries. And at one point, we hired a new investigator. He was a 21-year-old graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University, State University in Richmond, and oldest son of a Filipino-American family, first to go to college, had just graduated from VCU. He was with us a couple months, maybe 3 months. And one day I got a phone call. And the phone call was telling me that, in fact, he had died. And then I found out the backstory that, upon getting the job, he decided, for reasons unrelated to the job, but at the same time, he had some money now, and he had decided to buy a firearm. He thought it was important to protect his family. He still lived at the family home, had a younger brother, a couple of younger sisters, mother and father. I don't know if there was a third generation in the home or not. Very close-knit family. So he had bought a .44 Magnum. And, maybe weeks, months, a month after that, he heard a noise in the middle of the night. He got up with the gun, got his gun, and he was on the 2nd floor and proceeded to, go down the steps. He apparently did so in the dark. He apparently dropped the gun. The gun discharged and killed him. And I had to go on behalf of the office to the funeral, meet his parents. They were somewhat older than I was, not that much older at that time. I would have been maybe close to 50. They might have been a little older. They seemed ancient. They were destroyed.
Yeah.
Devastated. It was hard for me. And I had only known this young man for 2-3 months ago. It's terrible. I think about it to this day.
Yeah. Wanted to give each of you a chance to provide, if you see either a country that could be an example to the United States for how they work with guns in terms of either their public health policies or their legal guidelines. Or I'd like to give you the option of making a recommendation domestically for how you think we could help mitigate some of the costs of gun violence. And we'll conclude with this inquiry to both of you. Will, would you like to start today? This final question?
Sure, yeah. And you ask a complicated question that I think there's not a simple solution to. So I'll start with research. So there's been a lot of research in the United States on mass shootings, gun violence. Primarily, we've attributed these mass shootings and gun violence through access to firearms. That's the number one variable that differentiates us from other countries. So if we look at like Northern European countries, countries that come to mind in terms of their philosophical approach towards crime and sentencing, what comes to my mind is like Scandinavian countries, because they generally take a more holistic, person-centered approach toward sentencing for violent crimes. As Robert alluded to previously in the episode, people who have been harmed or victimized are likely to be perpetrators of harm and or victimization later in their lives. So harmed people harm people. And that's, I think, something that has always stuck with me about the data that's apparent about gun violence and crime in the United States and elsewhere. But our approach is different. We usually meet violence with violence here in the United States. We use mass incarceration. We still, in many places, employ the death penalty in the United States. And it's woven into our culture to meet violence with violence. But unfortunately, our approach is not that effective, right? Because we still incarcerate more people on the planet than most other countries do, particularly European countries, European and Western industrialized nations. So I think the one thing that we can probably learn from many other countries is their approach towards the sentencing of people who have inflicted harm, but also their approaches toward the regulation of firearms. Many other countries, such as Canada, Norway, and others, they have large populations, segments of their population that engage in hunting and own firearms. But we have some peculiar cultural need to amass weaponry that's not designed for hunting and or personal protection, but military type weapons that are designed for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to kill human beings. And so I think we might draw from some of those other nations, looking at their approach toward not only the regulation of firearms, but also approaches to sentencing.
Thank you.
I would like to go back to a cultural analysis. We're a culture that emphasizes, frankly, status, power, force. We like to punish. We don't like to nurture and support. A number of years ago, before Will's time, we had an open position in criminology, criminal justice, and we had a candidate come in from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, but she was a Canadian, and she was investigating militias at the Mexico-United States southern border. And at that time, there were militias that were, quote, protecting the border, right? They were down there to, corral people and hand them over to the border patrol. They would have liked to do more, but of course that would have been unlawful, since it's the border patrol's job to actually do this sort of thing. And they were armed and so forth. And, at the end of her talk, of course, we invited questions. And after a few other questions, I asked her, well, how can we just change Americans into Canadians? Because that's really the way to solve, all societal problems. Canadians don't have this kind of problem. The Canadian culture and many other cultures are much more congenial, supportive, nurturing, friendly, you name it. This is not a friendly place to live. It's a hard place to live. It's very hard. We can talk nicely about community at St. Martin's, but in general, there's no community. If you're marginalized, you're marginalized. And, white males have been given this carte blanche privilege for far too long. They're very angry. and they're angry for reasons they shouldn't be angry. You know, they're threatened because somebody has now told them you just can't do anything you want to do. You can't, you know, stalk women. You can't assault women. You can't harass women. Gee whiz, you know, all the, you know, lower status people that they used to ride herd over are not putting up with it anymore. And, you know, it's a real problem, but the guns again are just the afterthought. And the guns are too easily accessible. When guns are around, people kill themselves and they kill other people. Mm-hmm. If they weren't there, you know, it's really quite hard to kill somebody with your bare hands. That's challenging. I mean, you know, people will fight back. Mm-hmm. And so forth. Mm-hmm. And, you know, so the whole point of, you know, taking the guns away is to preserve lives that would just be lost otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank each of you for that final note and that final point of reflection on this topic today. There are a lot of different ways that we can continue our conversation with this topic of gun violence, but I really do appreciate the contributions that each of you made to this topic today and your ongoing work to bring about elucidation to your students and your communities about the problem that we have in this country with gun violence. Again, thanks to our guests, Doctors Robert Hauhart and William Stadler of St. Martin's University for joining us today on this episode of Lean in Olympia. Appreciate both of you. Thanks for being here. And check out our website for Interfaith Works and our Facebook page if you want to stay up to date with our most recent Lean in Olympia episodes. And finally, the next episode of Lean in Olympia will air on April 27th. It'll feature Executive Director Meg Martin. So again, thanks to both of our guests today. Appreciate you. Peace to all of you. Be well. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.